Thank you. Thank you, Marlon. Forward. So a little disclaimer um, that we always show to acknowledge our funder, which is the Office on Violence Against Women out of the Department of Justice. Forward. This is today's agenda. I want to start with the historical overview, review some definitions, and explore some root causes of violence, and discuss a little bit about why these crimes occur and the impact of these crimes on victims, the family, and community, and also to discuss some of the challenges and struggles faced by victims and those impacted as seen through the eyes of an advocate. So I just wanted to say that I am the Victim Advocacy Program Specialist. I've been with TLPI for about 20 plus years. And prior to coming to the Institute, I was an advocate for many years and primarily a rape crisis advocate and also a domestic violence advocate. So that's the context for the information that I'll be sharing with you today. And um, as I traveled across Indian country, I see the incredible work being done by a lot of advocates in their communities, often with very limited resources, and are doing some amazing work. But one of the gaps that I've seen for many years is the legal services that a lot of our Native victims, a lot of our Native relatives who've been victimized by these crimes that I'll be sharing today, the legal services, the legal issues they face, and the services they need. And those services are often not readily, easily accessible. And if they are, perhaps some of those legal services may not fully understand these crimes and the impact of these crimes on the victims and also the communities where these victims live. So that's kind of the focus of our grant, and a target audience for our training and technical assistance grants from OVW is to help legal services provide training, resources, technical assistance to legal services that may work with our relatives in tribal communities who experience these crimes. So I wanted to just say a little bit about this project. Next slide. Anytime I've done training in the past or I've visited in tribal communities, I always want to start with a positive, sort of a visionary focus of the work that we do with our relatives who've experienced these crimes, because I really believe that a lot of the type of services that our relatives in tribal communities need are based in our cultural traditions. And we come from a history of having very strong traditional customs, values, and traditions that our relatives can benefit from. So I always encourage tribes to look at those and incorporate those values and customs within the work that they do. And as part of that, we look at how women were treated. And I use women as, the primary focus of who the victims are, because statistically, that's who are mostly being victimized are the women and children. So, and it's not to exclude men and other gender types. So I just wanted to say that first. Um, from a cultural historical perspective, there were no rape words like rape in our tribal languages. So my conclusion about that, it's pretty anecdotal, but I believe because there wasn't a word for rape, that rape didn't exist. um, children were seen as a gift from the creator, and there was a strong mother-child bond. And I put this out there especially for people like who those of you that are working with tribal laws, for example, or are working in our tribal court system, to really keep that bond in mind, that if that bond is weakened somehow because there are issues that our relatives are facing that may impact their ability to parent their children. It doesn't mean they're bad parents. It means that they may need additional support services to strengthen that mother-child bond rather than removing that bond or taking that responsibility from the non-offending parent. So that's another reason I like to, start with these customs and traditions. Um, so we, violence as with any trauma experienced by tribal nation was addressed collectively. So that's kind of my uh, opening into eventually I'm going to be discussing and sharing with you in our third webinar about the importance of doing collaborative work with each other and across jurisdictions even is so important because we have resources that we can share with those that are helping our relatives in our communities, but they also have resources that can benefit us in the work that we do with crime victims. So that collaborative coordinated work is really important. Next slide. I want to share with you some definitions. I'm not going to read these definitions, but I really feel that, they're helpful in a number of ways so that we're sort of all on the same page, but also, perhaps you may be able to use them in your own work if you're looking at what constitutes these different crimes. And the definitions, of course, are going to vary based on, state definition, or even if you have these crimes within your tribal codes, your tribal laws, those definitions may vary, or you may also, maybe these definitions might somehow inspire your work locally, and maybe even in terms of developing grants and so forth. So I always like to include definitions, although they may vary. So I wanted to point out some of the main words in these definitions. So like for domestic violence, it's a pattern of behavior involving the use or attempted use of physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, economic, or technological abuse. So there's many different types of forms of the abuse within domestic violence, but there's a pattern, right? So we're not talking about a one-time incident per se, although it could be. Generally, we're going to look at a pattern, and a lot of these types of abuse that are listed here, we may not see. We may not see the emotional, the verbal, right? Often those are done behind closed doors. The gestures, the looks, the threats. And I mention these because these are the different types of intimidation that an abuser can utilize in order to maintain power and control. That there's some potential violence that's connected to those types of body language, those looks, those stares, those the intimidation that you may even see in courtrooms. If you watch abusers, a certain kind of a look may mean something to a victim. So it's important to monitor that as well in your courtrooms. Next slide. Definition of stalking. Again, crime of power and control, course of action directed at an individual that causes victim to fear for their safety. Okay. And oftentimes we see this crime in the course of domestic violence, for example. If we have a victim who's filed for a protection order, sometimes you'll also see this crime of stalking that an abuser may engage in. And again, this is an abuser's way of demonstrating their need for power and control, and may stalk that person perhaps in their workplace and make things difficult for the victim to maintain a job. So again, it's a victim's right to not be stalked, to be able to even help employers look at, stalking, and to not punish the victim for what the perpetrator is choosing to do. So these are the different acts that are listed within the definition. Next slide. And you'll see some resources that are being dropped in the chat. So I just invite you to take a look at those resources and those links. Thank you, Heather. Here's a definition, and the citation is there. Non-consensual sexual act. Again, it may vary. It could vary within your tribal or state laws. I think a key part of that is where the victim lacks the capacity to consent. If it's because of a physical condition, if it's um, a learning disability, again, um, the issue of consent is important, is key. Okay. Dating violence. And often this is really difficult because, there's particular kinds of factors that need to be present in, for example, in domestic violence, there are certain factors in order for a victim to be able to obtain a protection order. And oftentimes, dating violence situations, victims may not have those. There may not be a child in common, for example. So it makes it really challenging for victims of dating violence to obtain protection, legal protection. And these are some of the signs of dating violence. And a lot of the victims often are adolescents, are teens. And I've worked with a lot of young people, young adults who are being abused by their partners, and it can come in many forms, in a physical form, verbally, emotionally, just as well as domestic violence. But the key factor is that they may not be, in living in the same household, or they may not have a child in common, like I said, but still they've had a relationship, and the patterns of abuse are very similar to domestic violence. And with today's technology, a lot of it can happen through social media, for example, where maybe even a abuser can take pictures of the victim and either threaten to post them and really make it challenging and difficult for the victim. And there needs to be some protections in place for the victim, because again, those are being done without the victim's consent. Financial abuse and sexual abuse. We see all of these present in a lot of dating violence situations. And again, we'll share, that this webinar, the first three webinars are going to be advocacy, right? I will be presenting the first three. There's going to be a series of three more webinars that'll be facilitated by my colleague, Kelly Stoner, and she'll talk a little bit more on the legal part of helping victims gain some legal protections against a lot of these different crimes. I also, part of our training in technical assistance is to go a little bit deeper in a lot of these different crime areas. So this first one is really to do an overview of the different crimes we're talking about. But again, it takes a lot more time to dive deeper, right, into any one of these different types of ways that abusers may engage in perpetrating these crimes against the victim. Next slide. So this is the data. We have the sources, and if you want, I believe they'll be made available to participants, where where this information comes from, where this data comes from. And, you know, really what they tell us is there's still a high percentage of our Native women, Native relatives who are being victimized by these crimes of domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual violence, stalking. And there's different terms used for many of these crimes, right? Um, you know, back in the day, we used to not want to say sexual abuse because it somehow minimizes. So for a while there, we were using sexual assault or sexual violence even to discuss these crimes because it gives those crimes a little bit more meaning or the impact that it has on victims. I won't read the data to you. It's here. So I want to take some time to explore root causes. You know, one of the questions often when in the course of working with victims of all of these different types of crimes and in my work of being an advocate on the ground, working with victims, you know, the most common question has been why? Why did this person do this? Why did they choose to assault me? Why did this person rape me? Why did this person that I love, that I care about, choose to abuse me, to harm me in this way? Why me? Is always the question, the lingering question. And you know, it's often difficult to help them, but I believe that a lot of the work that we do as advocates is to help them understand these crimes and where they come from. Why are these crimes so high and so prevalent within our tribal communities? So I want to talk a little bit about, share a little bit with you about root causes. So, like I said, there's different labels used for these different crimes. You know, we often hear the term family violence, and I tend to want to stay away from that terminology, because it implies that this whole family is sort of choosing to be violent against one another when generally there is a perpetrator. There is, we need to look at who's making this choice, who's ultimately, in domestic violence, we talk about predominant aggressor, right? Who's the person who is more powerful here? Who's yielding that power and how are they using it? How are they using that to exploit others, right? That have less power within that family or that setting, because ultimately that person needs to be held accountable for their choices, for making the choice to be violent and to abuse and to harm a family member or a partner. And if we term it all as family violence, and somehow this family is dysfunctional and we have to send the whole group off to therapy, then we may miss the opportunity to hold that person accountable for the choice they make, to use these different acts of threats and so forth, the tactics, in order to maintain power and control, right? Because that is the primary motive. If we ask an audience, why is this person doing this? What's to be gained? Right? And it's generally the power and control, which is at the hub of this wheel. This wheel has been around for a long time. It came out of a program in Duluth. A dear friend of mine, Ellen Pence is her name. She started a program up in northern Minnesota and worked in the field for many, many years. She passed a few years back, and this was one of the models that they used back then. So the center is the hub. This is the primary motive that we see for why violence happens. This is the main reason, I guess, abusers abuse, why they choose to abuse. And that's important to remember, that people make a choice to be violent, right? it's nothing that is happening that, someone forces them or someone causes them. It's that person's, that victim's fault for X, Y, and Z is the reason why I hit her, the reason why I, threw her on the ground. It's a choice they've made, and they could have made a different choice. Even if they were having their own personal issues, they could have chosen to walk away. They could have chosen to not engage, to not say anything. And that's the work of people who work with offenders to help them identify when those emotions are escalated, and how to not engage and choose to use violence to exert power and control over a victim. So we have people who work with offenders, and I really support, tribes developing those kind of programs. They're batterer intervention programs. And I highly recommend all of our tribal communities to develop those types of programs, because it's important to hold offenders accountable for the choices they make, whoever those offenders may be. So the spokes would be the tactics that offenders use, and these techniques are are so the tactics used are so important to understand. And because often you may see them, you see the impact of these tactics and how victims respond to them. You may even see that, like I said earlier, in the courtroom. Um, and I've even experienced them as an advocate. If a perpetrator, a batterer sees me with the victim as the victim's advocate, oftentimes they may blame me for, breaking up their family or somehow disrupting that person's, power, and, their need for power and control, and empowering the victim to be able to find some help and to get some support and to get some protections, right? Some legal protections even. And oftentimes they'll blame me for that, or blame the advocacy program for that. So we get the looks, we get the threats, we get the stares, right? So I don't know how many advocates are among all of you as participants, but I'm sure you all have been at the target end of those kind of looks and stares and threats and so forth. And, they can be kind of scary, right? So, and we're not even the primary victim for those threats. So I just encourage you to be aware of those. It can come in the form of body language. It could come in the form of the looks, the verbal threats, and so forth. Children, using children to exert power and control over a victim, threatening a victim that if you leave me, I'll take the children, you'll never see them again. I'll let the courts know that you're an unfit mother. And if somebody's already experiencing emotional abuse and all of the put downs and all of the you're no good, you're a bad mother, you're an unfit mother, look, you smoke weed, you sell weed, whatever those threats are, I'm going to report you to child protection and you'll never see the children again. Those are common threats that this, non-offending parent may hear, and they believe those threats. They believe that abuser has the power to carry out those threats, and they certainly don't want to lose custody of their children. So, like I said earlier, incorporating even within tribal laws and tribal codes, which they may already exist within your tribal codes and laws, that this bond between mother and child is very sacred and needs to be even strengthened more if it looks like it's weakened somehow because the mother is having problems with domestic violence or with chemical abuse and addiction issues, to strengthen, her ability to parent her children. I'm sure in a way that she truly wants to be empowered, but is unable to find resources for, like I said, for treatment or for legal protection. So I really encourage that instead of punishing the mother, punishing the non-offending parent. So a lot of minimizing, denying, and blaming. Oftentimes they'll say it wasn't that bad. We were just kidding around, teasing around, but somehow or another minimizing what's happened. But if the victim gets to a safe place and is able to talk to someone they trust, like an advocate, oftentimes you'll hear the real truth behind what's happening. So I encourage programs, legal services to connect victims with advocates as soon as possible. As soon, that's probably one of the first questions that any service provider can ask if that victim has an advocate. And if not, to be able to know your resources, where you can refer someone in order for that victim to have an advocate. Using isolation also, because that makes it a little bit more easy for that perpetrator to maintain power and control. So these are, a lot of the tactics that we see. Economic abuse is another one where the abuser maintains control over the financial resources, the assets. Their house or their apartment might be in the perpetrator's name, for example. It's important to look at that, especially, who's going to be able to live in the home there. If we're talking about, it may look different for, a victim who's been raped in their home. They may not want to be in that home anymore. They may want to have outside shelter and safety outside of the home because that perpetrator knows where that, the victim lives. So they may not want to remain in the home. Or even if they feel relatively safe there, there's a lot of, bad memories. So there's that aspect in terms of the need for resources that perhaps advocates might be able to help with. But also the legal end of this is that if there's some possible threats for eviction or unlawful detainers because of something that the victim hasn't caused, perhaps the abuser broke the door down or broke the windows or punched a hole in the wall, whatever it might be, that's something that a victim hasn't done. Or maybe the perpetrator is the one who is holding the job and has to pay the rent or the mortgage, but chooses not to. So there's the victim, the non-offending parent, the victim who, is being threatened with eviction because the rent or, the mortgage hasn't been paid. So it's important to look at that so victims aren't re-victimized through the actions of the abuser, the perpetrator. So, in workplace also, like I said, with stalking, oftentimes an abuser can stalk the victim at their workplace. And if they are now the single wage earner for the family, it's important to, look at employment rights for that victim. That rather than firing them because an abuser is stalking them and, the employees are afraid they're going to be harmed, the abuser has one target person, and that's the victim. That's their primary target. And it's important to look at that and to provide adequate protections rather than punishing, re-victimizing a victim by firing the victim for the behavior of the abuser. So, looking at what the employment laws are in your community, in your jurisdiction, is also really important. So I could say so much more about the tactics used. What we see finally on the outside of this wheel are the legal outcomes, the crimes that are committed, and the legal definitions that we often see. But there's so much more that happens behind closed doors that we may not see, right? So I still like this model. Some people say it's outdated, but I think it still is very relevant. Next slide. So I want to say a little bit about the impact of these crimes. Um, I there's a lot of, speculation. There's people who say, well, if she's in a bad relationship, why don't she just leave? Sort of those kinds of conclusions or suggestions, maybe even. And oftentimes, when a victim has experienced this, the first place they go uh, perhaps would be a trusted friend, a trusted relative, um, and then also to seek some help eventually. And oftentimes, that's the suggestion that they may receive is, you know, why don't you just leave? Or if that person's been raped, for example, it's like, well, what did you do? Did you do something to provoke that person? Or did you how did you try to run, or did you kick them or fight back? These are some of the responses that oftentimes victim will receive, which may not be real helpful. So I ask that you think about those kind of responses and the impact of even the responses that victims may receive after they're reaching out for some help. Initially, the impact is going to vary from one individual to the next. So, next slide. And the impact has a lot to do with, the type of assault that's happened. If it's, like I said, if it's a pattern, if there's been a lot of physical injury, a lot of trauma. And I hesitate saying that because oftentimes, when we talk about emotional abuse and verbal abuse and threats and so forth, that don't necessarily include physical trauma, physical harm to the body, because oftentimes as responders, as service providers, there's been many times I've met victims in emergency rooms in hospitals where they may not have any visible injuries at all. You may not see any sign of that at all. So, what does that often lead responders or providers to believe? What's the conclusion, or what are assumptions? If you see no injuries, this victim is not crying, this victim is not, in fact, they may be speaking pretty, you know, coherently. They may even be speaking pretty assertively as far as what they want, what they're looking for. What's the conclusion, do you suppose? Sorry, got a tickle in my throat. Yes, you could share comments. When we talk about first responders, I always think about, it's not always necessarily law enforcement or paramedics, right? Yes, Jesse says sometimes they're viewed as not in distress when they don't show emotion. Exactly, exactly. And when we see that, we sometimes minimize, the impact. So I wanted to just start this with saying, we have to look and remind ourselves there's a lot that may have happened that we don't know behind closed doors. For example, in the case of domestic violence, those threats are real to that victim. Those threats are real. And without any signs of physical injury, without any physical trauma, towards this person, the threats alone are very traumatic. So, and then also, if they're not receiving the kind of support, that may very well discourage victims from participating in any kind of a legal response or legal uh, services that they may receive. It's like if the blame is being put back on them, well, what did you do to provoke him? Or what did you do in turn? Or what was your part in this? If that response is not real, empathetic or helpful to that victim, they may pull away. and not want to receive services even. So I wanted to say that up front to be mindful that not all victims are going to show physical injury. But these are some of the signs. Victims minimize the first responder needs to fully get the story. Watch body language, absolutely, and the nonverbal. Absolutely. Thank you. And these are some of the other impacts that we may see trauma impact on victims. They may have difficulty concentrating, difficulty making decisions, especially at a time when they're faced with being deluged with a lot of questions and having to make decisions, not just about themselves, such as if they want to file a police report, they're faced with that in their minds, that perpetrator saying, if you report this, I'm going to come and kill you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to kill my children. Those words are reverberating in that victim's mind. And those threats are real, especially if there's even the presence of guns or weapons. Again, that even makes it even more, uh, more traumatic for that victim, knowing that this perpetrator could very well carry out those threats. So even the decision to report to police can be a really difficult one. Um, so, if they're having difficulty making decisions, or maybe their story, how they relate the events of what happened. I don't like to use the term story because oftentimes people, make up stories that in that context, right? So I don't like to use the term story, maybe relating back the events of the crime. They may have difficulty remembering because they've been traumatized, and it's not a good time for them to make decisions at the moment. So bear that in mind as well. It's not like they're fabricating. It's just a really difficult time for them. And these are additional kinds of possible impact on victims. I think a big one for a lot of them is the fear of losing their children. Um, so I'm not going to go over each one of these individually, but I ask that you would keep them in mind. And because however a victim is responding is natural, is normal for that victim, right? Because everyone has their own way of doing trauma, and what works for one may not work for everyone, right? So it's important for us not to make assumptions, or somehow minimize because they're not reacting in a way that we may think that they should be reacting. I had a victim once who was raped, and she jumped in her car and she chased that perpetrator with her car up and down or the streets, and was going to definitely, if she caught up to him, was going to run him over. That was her reaction. That was her way of doing trauma. She came to the she was physically harmed, so I met her in the emergency room. This woman had some, physical injuries, but she was very powerful. She had a good description of him. She got a license plate number. She had all the information. She wanted to file a police report. She wanted this person in jail. Very out, sort of outward with her, expressions. Her anger was clear, that she was very angry. That's different, I didn't see a whole lot of that in a lot of victims, but that was her way of doing trauma, right? So I just wanted to say it can vary across the board, across the continuum. Next slide. In addition to the current trauma that this victim may be experiencing, we have also a long history of historic trauma. We have the abuse that's happened, from our ancestors that we still carry, we still struggle with, we still are healing from. And this is a definition that I use a lot. People who have endured historical trauma may exhibit the historical trauma response with symptoms such as unresolved emotional trauma. And we've seen the high mortality rates in our communities, the depression, the alcohol, drug abuse, child abuse, domestic violence. And we see that today in a lot of our relatives who are addicted to opioids, for example. I firmly believe that's part of our historic trauma. That's part of our unresolved grief. And you add the layer of current, a lot of these problems that we still have in our families and our communities. And we have to be able to utilize our cultural traditions, like I said at the onset, to be able to help one another, to help ourselves with the medicines that we have. And I'll talk a little bit about what those medicines are. But again, I wanted to say we can't exclude this history. It's part of us. It's who we are. It's in our genes. Next slide. This is something I
Bonnie,
use.
just
Yes.
really quickly, we have about 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is I don't want to call it a model, but it's sort of an image that I've used for well over 30 years, maybe longer, to help people understand how violence can impact a person, right? And I call it whole person impact. That a violent incident, it could even just be one-time incident, can harm a person in all of these different areas, right? If you think about someone who's been raped by someone they trusted, maybe someone they loved, and obviously there's going to be some emotional harm. So the line is the violation. There's going to be some emotional harm. There may be some physical harm, and also maybe even intellectually, or their mind. Maybe this perpetrator said, you're responsible for this happening. It's all your fault. You made me do this. If you weren't this, if you weren't that, this wouldn't be happening. And also it can impact their spirits. When I say a spirit, it could harm their um it kind of looks a lot like depression, right? A broken spirit, where they may not even want to engage in spiritual ceremonies because they are feeling that low about themselves, right? So these are all the impact of a crime that happens to individuals, right? To one individual. And on the other side of that, I take this image and I use it in visiting communities to say, let's talk about all the different ways that someone can be harmed in this way and how we see them, the signs of the harm that's been done. Even if we look at physically, if we look at someone who's been raped, the impact of that rape on them physically, where they may need medical attention, where they may need a forensic examination to gather evidence, but also they may need to seek medical services to address physical injuries. They may need medical services in order to obtain, a pregnancy prevention plan, the Plan B. And so it's important to encourage victims, although all of these choices, they're options for victims, whether they're going to file a police report, whether they're going to seek medical attention, whether they want to go get help for some healing. Those are all options that are available to a victim. But again, it's options. It's their choice that we give them back that power, because again, like I said, the primary motive for violence is a perpetrator's need for power and control. So, it's important to give victims back their decision-making power. In order to help them, to empower them, we have to give them good information about resources, that we don't send victims on a wild goose chase and to a program maybe that no longer exists, or to give them a phone number for a program that doesn't have that it's not answering. They don't have a 24-hour hotline, for example. So we have to be mindful of the resources that we're sharing. And I think that's another way that we can help, legal services, is to help them with resources where they can refer people that they're seeing, that you all are seeing, even in your work, in your line of work. But we have to do our own homework to make sure that we're knowledgeable about resources so that victims can make informed decisions about the kind of services they're going to seek and their options. But we support them, right? As advocates, we say it's about our ability to support victims' choices. Whether we agree with them or not, we support them. But our number one thing that we look at is the importance of safety. If they're choosing to return to an abuser, that's a choice they're making. But at the same time, we can say, I'm really concerned about your safety. And let's talk about safety planning, right? So you're going to hear much more in this webinar series about safety and safety planning and victim rights. Um, and but that's an advocate's probably number one lookout, is the victim's safety. I'm concerned about your safety in your choice to return to the abuser. Let's do some safety planning. What can you do? Who can you call? Here are some resources. And if you work in a shelter, you work in an advocacy program, definitely you can welcome that person back to seeking services again. Ensure that they're not going to be turned away, even if this is the fourth, fifth, sixth time that they're leaving the abuser. They're going to be welcome back. Next slide. I wanted to say one more about this as far as healing for victims. Um, there's medicines that we have, and I ask you to really look at medicines in a different light. That medicines can be, a physical medicine. They may receive through therapy if they've perhaps maybe in the past have had problems with depression. It's important that maybe this trauma related to this crime has somehow they're now having problems with depression. uh it's important for us as advocates, especially, to not cross over into other areas that we are not licensed to do work in that area, such as therapy, or also in a legal sense. I always make sure the people, the relatives that I worked with, the people I worked with, know that I'm not a lawyer, I'm not law trained. I may be familiar with some of the laws that pertain to what's happening, but I'm not a lawyer. This is something that I think is important for us as advocates in terms of working with people in the legal services, or even in other areas like therapy, that I don't want to have this person believe that I'm a therapist, right? So when I say medicine, there's a lot of different medicines, which can include therapy, but also can include healing ceremonies that maybe victims want to partake in. So I ask you to be mindful about spiritual leaders that you refer people to. Just a minute. Okay, my battery was running low. The impact on children, as you provide services to victims that have children, this could be impacting them, and they also may need services. So to be familiar with the services that are available to children is also really important. Um, and this is again the effects that domestic violence, for example, may have on our children, our native children, or all children. So I'm not going to read these. These are just some statistics and how some of our children struggle. And we say that, our children are sacred to us, and that our work should focus on their needs and how they're being impacted if they've witnessed their mother being assaulted, abused, and to help them understand that it wasn't their fault either. If there's a breakup If their mother or whoever is the non-offending parent, if they choose to leave the family, it's not their fault. They did nothing wrong to cause this. Okay, next slide. And this is important because there's studies been done that look at the long-term effects. And, I always say that if they grow up with, seeing this violence, that they learn to see the world in two ways, either as a victim of violence or a perpetrator. So it's so important that we educate and we teach our children the good ways. Okay, next slide.
Bonnie, we're at about 5 minutes. I know we've
Okay,
got some, but it's okay if we go over.
okay. So these are some of the challenges, some of the complex service needs, and this is the reason I am so excited about this grant. The challenges are very similar to victims that live in rural areas. Our communities are small. We have large reservations, but we still have the capacity to know one another. And privacy and confidentiality are so closely linked to safety. Victims need to feel a sense of safety and to know that their rights are going to be protected, that what they share with others will not go beyond who they're sharing this with. We also have to keep in mind that batters can be very transient, especially in the summertime when there's a lot of ceremonies, celebrations that are happening across Indian country. I've seen so many victims of domestic violence who are concerned about having their perpetrator be at the next celebration they're going to be attending and afraid that person may abduct their children, for example. So I always encourage them to seek some safety, like a protection order that'll cover them wherever they go across jurisdictions, and yet they come back and say, this particular tribe or this particular county didn't enforce my protection order, and they're concerned about that. So I always say, if you know ahead of time where you're going to attend a celebration, that perhaps you take a protection order, you take one over there, send it to them, and say, I'm going to be attending your celebration there in your community, and I'm afraid that my perpetrator will show up, and I want to make sure that I have some protection and my children are not abducted by that person. Um, there's a lot of distrust often of outside service providers. This is where we talk about wanting to reduce the possibility that they'll be re-victimized by service providers. We're supposed to be, helping them heal. We're supposed to be empowering them, providing them resources and accompanying, providing support to them, and especially legal services for them, for our relatives to get the kind of services that they need that they may not have access to. Travel can be very difficult for a lot of our Indian people because they may not have reliable transportation, especially our victims that are older and may not even be able to drive. So I I bring all these up as possible ways that we can help victims that, are in need of these services. And again, like I said, collaborative work across jurisdictions is really important, that we somehow look at the possibility of developing MOUs so there's a clear understanding about how we're going to work with one another across geographic lines. Okay, next slide. These are some of the legal issues that we'll be discussing in future webinars. And I've touched very briefly on them without going into all of the legal implications and so forth. My colleague, my friend Kelly Stoner will be taking a deeper dive in all of these different areas, and I'll be there to help from an advocate perspective. But these are some of the legal needs of victims. And I've been saying all along the importance of safety, protection of the children, and others in that kinship circle, because oftentimes they may be threatened. Just like I said, as advocates, often we may feel threatened even by the abuser. Freedom from ongoing abuse and harassment, even like in the workplace, to look at employment laws and sexual harassment, for example. confidentiality, privacy. We'll be talking more about victim rights to ensure that victims, those rights are upheld. Ability to work, attend classes without fear of being stalked. Worked with a lot of dating violence victims who, are attending college, maybe their tribal college with their perpetrator, or they even fear going to like a computer lab because they're afraid they're going to run into that abuser. So there has to be some protections there, even maybe perhaps meeting with the dean to say, how can this victim be protected in a legal way? Any housing, like I already said, fear of evictions, employment rights, victims taking leave due to abuse that may be happening. I would hope that tribes can, develop some good laws to protect the tribal employees, for example, that work in casinos, for example. And also minors seeking protection, those that adolescents that are in dating violent situations, that they too can get the protection they need even though they may not have children or they may not living with their perpetrators. Next slide. Just another quote. I love using quotes. It's often said that crime victims are traumatized twice, first by the crime itself and then by the criminal justice process. And this is where, we all can help is to minimize, if not prevent, that type of re-victimization by placing blame or not being able to provide the services that are needed. I'm going to share some resources with you. I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues who will take you through our resources and where you may find these resources, as well as I'd like to hear back from you all with an evaluation. But I personally want to just thank you all for joining us. And it's been my honor to be able to share and visit with you all. It would be wonderful if I could go on site someday and meet you all in person. But thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Heather Torres. She went ahead for your request, Bonnie, and dropped some links for the resources listed here on this resource slide. Those include links to the website for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, and for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. In particular, we shared resources for our publications and our tribalresponse.org resource. As we continue to wrap up and be respectful of your time, we'll, as a friendly reminder, send the PowerPoint deck in this recording to registrants. Here is our main TLPI website, home.tlpi.org. We also have a textbook co-authored by today's presenter and also Professor Sarah Deer and former TLPI employee Maureen White Eagle sharing our stories of survival, Native women surviving violence. There's a QR code that we'll send out. And we briefly, for our publications, have a list of topics here that you'll be able to review in depth. And of note, we also have a website for folks whose work that involves the Violence Against Women Act. Again, our colleague Kelly Stoner in our future webinar series will be able to dive into a little bit more detail about some of these issues in pertaining jurisdictional covered crimes as covered by the Act. And if you have any questions during this broadcast or when you're reviewing the recording, we have presenter Bonnie Clairmont's information here. And as shared, let's go ahead and get that QR code posted today. We do have a question that we did answer from a couple of participants about youth perpetrator curricula. Our team is going to go ahead and take that question and go ahead and follow up through email. And we'll go ahead and keep the window open for a few more questions, submissions, but in a moment here, we'll go ahead and end the broadcast. And please keep an eye out for our post-event email with the YouTube link. There were no outstanding questions from the chat, just to let our presenters and participants know.